After the Securing Our Future conference in London, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer held a presser in which he discussed the key outcomes of the emergency summit. And now, joining me to discuss, I'd like to welcome Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House, Sir Robin Niblett. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us on World News tonight.
Pleasure.
Now, we're hearing about a coalition of the willing and the formulation of a European peace plan for Ukraine to be presented to the United States. This is what Starmer and Macron discussed with President Trump over the weekend. Now, what could a European plan to get to a ceasefire, what could that look like in comparison to what we've already heard from other places?
Well, I think this is part of continuity rather than some big new plan. Probably one of the most important elements right now was try to create a bridge between the very contentious press conference that took place in the Oval Office on Friday and a future outcome, not to lose the America and not to lose momentum towards some type of ceasefire after the debacle. So I think there's an element of, if I may say, of sort of performance to the summit taking place in London, but nonetheless, it is incredibly important because Europeans are going to have to show to Donald Trump that there is a plan for the future and that Europeans are committed to stepping up and taking responsibility for the security in Ukraine if a ceasefire can be negotiated. I think it's apparent, certainly to me, maybe to others, that the Trump administration has longer-term plans that are not just connected to the issue of the ceasefire. There's also a clear desire within the Trump administration to rebuild relations with Russia for the long term. So the Trump administration is looking further into the future. The European view and the view in London and the view of this summit is to try to keep a focus on the near term. And the near term is to have a ceasefire, to be able to have a certain amount of European countries committed to protecting that ceasefire by physically having troops on the ground, to have the US involved somehow in providing a backstop to that, as it's described, coalition of the willing, and to make sure that there's some sort of economic dimension to it. Do we keep the sanctions in place? Very importantly, do we keep military support going for the Ukrainian government? And finally, one of the elements that was raised in London, making sure that Ukraine and Europe are at the table from now on. Strangely, the fact that this press conference in the Oval Office ended in such a disaster has actually brought Ukraine back to the table and brought the Europeans to the table in terms of negotiation. The idea that this can just be a deal between Russia and Washington, with others just coming in occasionally to add as bit part players, I don't think that's going to be the shape of the future negotiation.
Well, and of course, there were criticisms about that for the last several days. Now, looking at what just happened in the White House, do you think this is a move things forward? I mean, I think I just heard you say that. Do you think that this was something that was needed to happen to, I guess, express a sense of urgency here? Or is it a setback when we look at relations between even Europe to some extent and the United States and, of course, United States-Ukraine?
You can't call the press conference on Friday a positive outcome. Personally, I would like to have seen that press conference, despite the very difficult things from a Ukrainian and a European perspective, despite the difficult things that President Trump and Vice President Vance said, you know, treating the two sides as equals, some of the very exaggerated comments about the situation in Ukraine. I mean, but what it did was reveal the true thinking behind this administration's positions, exposed it, you might say. Ironically, I think President Zelensky has come out of that debacle in the White House stronger in Ukraine, and therefore in a stronger position, ironically, to potentially make concessions in the future than he would have been as somebody taken a little bit like a lamb to the slaughter. I mean, I'm exaggerating for effect, but I think you'll understand what I mean. And also, it's forced the Europeans to the table and forced the Europeans to start to create some shape to this coalition of the willing. You've seen the UK government today already pledge an additional $3 billion in air defence funding. and a 2 billion additional amount there of access to UK export guarantees. And we've seen, I think, a very strong showing of European leaders in London today. So look, it's not good, but we weren't good going into the press conference. The only problem we have right now is the minerals deal between the US and Ukraine is on hold. And I think it is very important to get that negotiation completed and back on track, because it is the one way that the Trump administration will have skin in the game, if I can use that phrase, within Ukraine. And it may provide the leverage for him to provide, Trump administration to provide some type of security backstop to the Europeans. Because if there are Europeans in and on Ukrainian soil after a ceasefire, they won't just be protecting Ukraine, they will be protecting the US investment in Ukraine, in its strategic minerals. So I think it's still all to play for. That would be my standpoint. It was a brutal, horrible moment, but I think almost better to have it now than later.
So moving forward, how does President Zelensky now mend that relationship with Washington? Perhaps Europe should be maybe a middleman here in this. And I believe you mentioned the minerals deal. Would that be that would probably be key for President Zelensky to try and restart his relationship with Donald Trump?
Well, the bit of business that is left unfinished, obviously, is the minerals deal. As I think you and your viewers are aware, what they would have signed on Friday was not the deal. What they would have signed on Friday was an agreement to negotiate a deal. In other words, it would have started a process that still had a long way to go, including amounts of money, shareholdings of the investment structure, length of time. In any case, there are a lot of stuff to iron out. And I think the one issue here that the Europeans can try to do is to say to the Trump administration, look, we're putting more skin in the game, and to say to Zelensky as well, we're with you, maybe even more formally than we were before you went to Washington, but now we need you to complete the signature. I might say, just from a tactical standpoint, there's no need for this first early agreement to be signed at the White House. There's no need for it to be signed by the two presidents. It could be signed by the Secretary of the Treasury and the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, who were the two who were involved in negotiating this current preliminary deal, if I can call it. So again, the question is, what is the long-term US goal? And the long-term US goal and Trump's goal is to say, I delivered peace in Ukraine, partly because it's an electoral pledge, his credibility is on the line, but partly also importantly, as I said, because I think he wants to improve the relationship with Russia for the long term. And there is a China angle to this, and they've been explicit about it. I think they would not like to see Russia handed over to China. This administration, at least, which is, in my opinion, not interested in a just peace, it is only interested in peace. They want to be able to get past the ceasefire with Ukraine so they can start getting a closer relationship with Russia. As a European, that worries me, and I think as Europeans as a whole, that is a worrying sign, but I'm afraid it is a reality.
Well, we still have a long road ahead of us, Sir Robin Niblett, Chatham House distinguished fellow. Thank you very much for joining us and providing your insight. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.